Once upon a time, there was a woman who was a weaver. Not that she knew it or ever thought of herself that way. She didn't make multicoloured jumpers or funky modern tapestries to sell online as a side hustle. No, she wasn't an artistic sort. In fact, she wasn't even a seamstress. In truth, the woman would have been a jumble of fingers and thumbs if she'd been asked to so much as thread a needle to sew on a missing button, which was a bit unfortunate, as our weaver woman happened to be a hospital nurse. Thankfully for all, she left most of the needle business to the surgeons. On a good day, she could just about wield a needle for an injection, but even then, she would usually make you wince. Yes, the woman who was a weaver was a bit cack-handed, a little bit clumsy, butterfingered even, but nonetheless, her patients adored her. Any wince was soon forgotten. You can put up with a lot of fumbling if the care is well-intentioned, and in particular, if more is happening even than healing. "You should meet my patient in the ward next door," she'd suggest, without much thought and certainly no planning. "He's just lost his wife, but loves antiques and Sudoku, whatever it is, just like you do." And so, a poor broken old lady's rather brutal bed bath would shift from bordering on painful enough to make a complaint to suddenly quite perky. And more than once, a newly woven couple would wave a cheery goodbye at the door of our nurse's hospital ward as they returned to health and new life. It was a skill our woman had, and as with all the best skills, she neither knew she had it, nor would she have had any idea how she did it if you'd happened to ask her. But from a car crash, yes, sometimes a literal one, this woman could weave a wedding and babies even. From a terrifying near-death experience, a whole new thrilling life, and often for more than one to enjoy. These were all creative resurrections, and none of them were contrived. They just flowed, smooth as silken threads. "You could finally do that photography course while you recover, couldn't you? I'll get you a brochure. Or when I know a doctor who might lend you one of his cameras." Weave, 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 pulling threads, adding a dash of colour, spinning a rich texture, without even knowing it. As the years rolled by, the woman's skills had tapestried tales of all sorts together, into new ventures and lovers, and far more besides. Every tale threaded out from that hospital ward where she worked, radiating structures that would never have existed without her melding them together at pivotal moments in time. All this was invisible, of course, but it was as if tired old jumpers unravelled themselves at her feet in bunched-up knotty messes, but with just a bit of coaxing, she could reconstruct them into the softest comforter or a scarf with mittens to match. And not one needle, other than the odd misplaced medical one, was involved in all this weaving. Now the woman who was a weaver had a husband. He was a trumpet player in a crumbling jazz band that was just popular enough to earn a living. Just. The woman, who had never understood the mystical ability of musicians, deeply admired her man's artistry. She simply could not fathom it. "How do you know where you're going when it's your turn to solo?" she'd asked him more than once, as truly it was a complete puzzle to her, like a far-off galaxy or an abstract maths problem. "I just do," he would say, with the air of a creative soul who couldn't possibly be understood by one who wasn't wired that way, even if it was his own wife. The woman would feel gently put back in her place then, and try not to ask the same question for a while. She would, but not too soon anyway. Because it fascinated her. How could you start out and not know exactly how you want things to turn out? What if you didn't land on the right note to hand over to the double bass player, or your fingers ran away and changed the tempo up, so the drummer had to quickly juggle with his sticks? Each time the woman watched one of her husband's gigs, her heart would pound high up in her chest, and she'd bite her lip to bits. It wasn't quite a lack of trust in her husband's musical skills, but at times it did feel like it. She knew she wasn't artistic, so she hadn't a hope of understanding, had she? Her husband would nail it every time, of course he would, which further added to the mystery of his musical artistry. And his wife would stand and applaud with gusto, and then reapply her lipstick. Phew, it had worked out just fine. Who knew where that could have gone if it hadn't? What the trumpet player never shared with his wife was that his creativity came from guaranteed formulaic twists and tricks that pretty much ensured just the right finish, on time and in key. In fact, to those in the know, his ingenious improvisations were as recognizable as concrete signposts and bus stops, and the years of practice he'd put into playing them meant what was loudly applauded as inspired genius was in reality drearily automatic, and actually, most nights, a bit of a chore. Creativity has many forms, and not all those who seem to be creators are that ingenious at heart. Occasionally, when time and budget allowed it, the woman and her husband would host a social evening. Nothing too fancy, you understand, but in their two-up, two-down cottage, a hearty roast dinner always went down beautifully. On more than one occasion, the woman would invite ex-patients who were now indebted friends, the sort she'd done a bit of weaving for a while back and who wanted to keep in touch. She was oblivious to why, of course, and just thought that she was blessed with the sweetest of patients. It was always wonderful to see how they'd chosen to create the ongoing tapestries of their lives, even if she'd never ever have used that sort of highbrow arty-farty language. If you hadn't suggested those electronic cigarettes, I'm not sure I'd be alive now. The woman would hear her guests comment, of course, laugh in response, but she'd be far more focused on offering a second round of a rapidly collapsing dessert that was slipping off the plate due to the hot custard sauce. Who would have thought it? I never had my own children, but now I have a clan of his grandchildren to enjoy. Our weaver woman would simply think of how horribly expensive that must be at Christmas, and to let her lovely guests serve their own custard next time. And so these little dinners, delightful as they were nothing more than social fun and shared laughter. And there's a tremendous amount to be said for such simple things, more than anything, maybe. And in not one moment of them did the woman who was a weaver see that she was doing anything remarkable. For her, the noteworthy achievement was getting through the evening without clumsily serving someone's dinner into their lap. Yep, she'd managed that more than a couple of times. And people's lives just took funny turns and twists and timings. Doesn't everyone's? That surely is life's way. But an odd thing happened after each of these evenings that the woman did notice. A mood would descend on her musician man. He would become quiet and seem sad when they went to bed after, and wouldn't hold her close until she was fully asleep, as he usually did. he'd tend to spend the next day entirely with his trumpet, only broken by moments when he'd play a few bars of a refrain he said had just come to him. She would marvel at how this happened, how creative he was being in their own tiny home, and her reaction was always gushing, but also always felt less than he seemed to need. This mood would pass soon enough without comment from either of them. It was probably all part of the mystical artistic process, the woman told herself. And so, the woman who was a weaver never knew or saw that she was one. And her musician husband, who would have given his right arm for the improvisational skills he saw in his wife, never could quite bring himself to applaud her creativity. It's a good job that we're all artists in ways that are true to ourselves. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.